to transform its followers into people who are peaceful and compassionate, treating people of all sexes, religions, nations, and sexual persuasions with respect and with kindness. This has been a topic he's addressed in many of his books and talks. A key element in Professor Rambachan's education began in 1973, when just after receiving his undergraduate degree, he was accepted by Swami Chinmayananda to travel and participate in Chinmaya Mission's first intensive multi-year course of study in Vedanta and Sanskrit. As a part of that course, Professor Rambachan studied the Bhagavad Gita and the Upanishads for 3 years, as taught by Swami Dayananda Saraswati. Professor Rambachan has been involved in the fields of interreligious relations and dialogue for over 25 years as a Hindu participant and an analyst. He has contributed to numerous consultations and discussions convened by national and international organizations concerned with interreligious issues. So join me, everyone, please to give him a very warm welcome. Thank you for joining us. Good morning, good evening to wherever you are. Please join me in welcoming. And I would request all those who can please turn on their videos for just a moment, turn on your videos so that he can see all of you from all the parts of the world joining us today.
Wow. Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Rao, for your kind words, and also for inviting me. I'm very honored to have received your invitation, and I want to thank you personally for your interest in my work, for your hospitality to me today, and of course to Amrita University for inviting me to speak with all of you. I'm looking forward to it very much. I know you're all in different parts of the world in different time zones. So this is a wonderful international gathering. So what I'm going to do today is to speak about, the relationship between the Advaita Vedanta tradition and the sustainable development goals. In doing so, I want also to speak about some of the challenges that I see, for Advaita, some of the challenges it must overcome in order to speak meaningfully, in order to contribute its resources to sustainable development goals. Now, the Bhagavad Gita, a text with which I know all of you are familiar, which is, of course, one of our seminal texts, commends the idea of the universal common good. The word that is used in Sanskrit there is loka sangraha. Loka sangraha. So we are asked to consider loka sangraha, which I'm translating as the universal common good, all of our choices that we make, in all of the actions that we undertake. This must be at the center of our concerns. As you can see, the Sanskrit word used in the text for the universal community is loka. And loka for me is a very inclusive word. It embraces all existence. It is not anthropocentric. One who is concerned about the universal common good values all life, is devoted to the flourishing and to the sustainability of all life. Now, this universal common good is universal in many ways, in the sense that it embraces the well-being of all, but also in the sense that it includes all dimensions of life. So it includes all life, and it includes all dimensions of life. So in the interrelated fabric of existence, the issues that concern the public good stretch far and wide and transcend the dualisms of public and private, religious and secular. Those of us who are concerned about the universal common good cannot compartmentalize life. This is the point I'm trying to make. The Sustainable Development Goals are our most, this is how I think of them. I think of them as our most recent statement and consensus about what this common good means. It's an unpacking of the meaning of Loka Sangraha, the universal common good. Our religious traditions, therefore, including the Hindu tradition and more specifically the Advaita tradition, must commit and assume responsibility and join partnerships for the realization of these goals. There is a very beautiful prayer or affirmation in the Hindu tradition. I'm sure that many of you are familiar with it. It goes across all the different family of Hindu traditions. May all be happy. May all be free from disease. May all know that which is good. May no one suffer. In the Sanskrit we recite, Sarve bhavantu sukhinaha, Sarve santu niramayaha, Sarve bhadrani pashyantu ma kaschit dukha bhag bhavet. So as you will see in this beautiful prayer, the word that is repeated is sarve, all, the inclusivity of this mantra, expressing a hope for universal well-being, for universal happiness, for freedom from suffering for all beings. But I think, this also comes with an obligation. We can't leave it simply as an oral recitation. It comes with an obligation. We stop teaching, we have also to inquire into the sources of human suffering and to think and to formulate policies that aim to overcome these basic causes. And I think there is no long-term freedom from suffering without sustainable development as articulated in the Sustainable Development Goals. I think the challenge is not that we do not have the resources for implementing the Sustainable Development Goals. I think the resources are there in our world, natural and human resources. What is lacking is the will to do it. That's where I think the challenge is. And that's why I believe, this topic today is so important. What our religious traditions can bring in a very special way is the moral commitment, are the moral resources that inspire us to work for the achievement of the sustainable goals. Because as I am saying, working for the overcoming of suffering, I regard as a fundamental religious obligation. And I think, as I'll try to show, the Advaita tradition provides deep moral resources and justification for sustainable development goals. But what I want to do first of all is, I think it's important that we identify some of the challenges for Advaita with the Sustainable Development Goals. Because I think, and this is very important in my work. I come to this work as a Hindu scholar, as a Hindu practitioner, also with a deep love for my tradition, but also with the skills of critical thinking. And when I use those skills to look at the Advaita tradition, I see potential. I see great gifts in the tradition. I see tremendous resources in the tradition, but I also see challenges that need to be overcome. And I think we need also to speak about both the potential and the resources of the tradition. But I think when we think of religion, we must also think of what are the challenges that religions must overcome in order to bring energy to the public good, in order to motivate people to devote themselves to the universal common good. So I want to briefly identify 5 challenges in this first part of my talk. So here is the first. The prominent interpreters, the prominent commentators, or as I said, interpreters of the Advaita tradition throughout its history have been renunciants. Of course, in our tradition, we speak of them as sannyasins. They are people who have entered into the fourth stage of life. Shankara himself, was a monastic. He was a sannyasin. Took vows for the fourth stage. And in the Advaita tradition, this is also broadly true of the Hindu tradition. So a lot of what I will say, covers both traditions. In the Advaita and broadly Hindu tradition, entering the fourth stage is a radically consequential action. The renouncer, the one who entered this stage of monasticism, is exempt from ritual obligations such as daily worship at dawn or dusk on special occasions. Entering the fourth stage also frees the renouncer from having to fulfill obligations that are associated with what we regard as the obligations of work. Marriage is dissolved. There's freedom from contractual debts, property is distributed among heirs, and so on. So there is there's a very close resemblance between the rituals of death and those that are performed to enter the fourth stage. So those who renounce include themselves in traditional offerings made to the departed ancestors, and their ritual implements are disposed of in a manner that is very similar to a person who has departed from this life. I make this point to say that the identity of the interpreter, the identity of the reader of the sacred text, and here we are speaking in a special way of the Upanishads and the Bhagavad Gita, or the Vedanta texts like Brahma Sutras and so on. The identity of the reader as a radical renouncer with what I have just described informs what he or she sees in the text, informs the focus on the resources of the text. In other words, the formal disassociation from professional obligations and other obligations have outcomes for what is important in the text and how the text is read. Think of it in this way. A renouncer without social ties is likely to have little interest in the ways in which material, social, historical, or other factors influence the nature and content of a sacred text. And I think such a person is similarly or likely to be indifferent to the social implications of the text. Having severed family and communal ties, the implications of the text for these matters are not likely to be uppermost in the mind of the interpreter or the reader. And so such matters include, for me, the relevance of religious teachings for economics, for law, for social, for gender relationship. The significance of the text is narrowed by the particular lens through which the reader brings to the text. So, but I don't think, that is the problem, but I don't think that the text can only be read in this narrow way. And this is the reading of the text as what we will say formally as Moksha Shastra. Certainly we should not give up on that. The text does have something important to contribute, to our understanding of what liberation means. But I think that we don't have to limit the potential of the text only to speak to that issue. We can ask questions about the implications of the text for life in this world. What kinds of human relationships are commended in the text? And what are the fundamental values, implicit or explicit, in the text that are normative for our lives in communities and families and professions? What are our obligations to each other, to the planet, to other forms of life? Who in the text are marginalized, victims of injustice, and what are our responsibilities to them? So we need, in other words, my first point is to retrieve the resources of the Advaita tradition for sustainable development goals. We need a much broader reading of the text and the resources of the text than might have been the focus of the more traditional reader who comes to it from a perspective of renunciation. I'm not arguing against that perspective. I'm just saying we need to enlarge the perspective. Second point, I think the Sustainable Development Goals, as is very obvious to all of you, requires that we take life in this world very seriously. And the challenge here is that there are interpretations of the world, in Advaita and broadly in many Hindu traditions, that I don't think always emphasize, the significance of the value of life here and now. You may be familiar with some interpretations that liken the world to a sense illusion that we conjure on the basis of experience and because of our ignorance of the true reality. So the point is that if the reality of the world is underplayed, when life in this world is not treated as significant and important for us, we may not feel drawn to the challenges or the problems of of life in this world. We may not, we may not want to be affected by events in this world. To respond to the world is to grant reality to the world, to treat as real that which is in reality does not exist, or which is an illusion. So I think if we take these to the extremes, we have interpretations that make it very difficult to take the issues of the world, such as poverty, injustice, seriously. Now, I think that while these are interpretations that are there, I think the Advaita tradition offers us, alternative interpretations for seeing the world as and I describe it in my writings, for seeing the world as a marvelous outpouring of the infinite one, the infinite Brahman. The world derives value from the fact that it originates from, it exists within, and it has its ultimate destination in the infinite one. It's a beautiful description in Taittiriya Upanishad about Brahman, the one from whom all has come, the one by which everyone is sustained, the final destination of us all. So I think we can interpret the world as positively as an outcome of the intentional creativity of the divine one, expressing the fullness of the divine one. In other words, I don't think that in Advaita, the world must necessarily be devalued. We can take the issues of the world seriously while at the same time holding on to the fundamental teachings of Advaita. Thirdly, I think there are interpretations of the meaning of liberation. In Sanskrit, the word is moksha, that sometimes describe this moksha or this liberation as freedom from the world and the freedom from samsara, described as the cycles of birth and death and rebirth. Now, samsara is a word also that sometimes, carries negative connotations. Samsara is often equated with ignorance and with suffering. And so when the world itself is equated with samsara, then the focus becomes attaining freedom from the world and not solving the world's problems. And again, I think there is a different way of thinking of the tradition, a different way of understanding the tradition, where the problem is not the world as world. And that's a mistake if we would say that, that's what Advaita means, that Advaita problematizes the world or the Jagat as world. I think if we look carefully, we will see that the Advaita tradition and so many other Hindu traditions do not see the problem as the world, but as a problem of avidya or ignorance. And of course, in this condition of ignorance or avidya, we see everything separate. We see everything unconnected. It's a fundamental misunderstanding of the nature of reality. So when we put the emphasis on avidya as the human problem, Then we move to understanding of moksha, not as freedom from the world, not as escape from the world, but as a transformation of how we are in the world. A transformation, a new understanding of ourselves in this world. So our longing is not to be free from the world, but to be in the world in a very different way. And I think that puts us in a position, in the Advaita tradition, to then think more deeply about impact, about unpacking, something that I don't think we work hard enough on, but which we need to do. We need to unpack the social implications of moksha. What are the social implications of moksha, of liberation? I mentioned one already, which is, loka sangraha. I think that's in the Bhagavad Gita is the most important implication of moksha. One who knows or understands what liberation is a person who is committed to and devoted to the universal common good. One such a person, again, using the language of the Bhagavad Gita, is committed to delights. The Gita says such a person finds delight in working for the well-being of all. Sarva bhuta hite rataha, delights, one whose joy is in the well-being of all. So we have resources here to see moksha, not as freedom from the world, but freedom from a certain understanding of the world, but which opens us up to a more empathetic way of being, the identification with others in suffering and in joy. So you have, the Bhagavad Gita praising the best yogi is the one who knows the suffering and the joy of others as his or her own. Fourth point, I think we have interpretations. I would identify those interpretations of karma, or the doctrine of karma, that comprehensively seek to explain all events in the present life as having causes that may be traced to actions performed in past lives, or even at an earlier point in this life. And I think such rigid interpretations of karma lead to fatalism, dispose us to seeing all forms of suffering, even injustices and oppression, as somehow justified. There is no injustice then. If you have such rigid interpretations of karma, you get to the point where you begin to think that all suffering is deserved suffering. There is no unjust suffering. The victim is responsible for his or her suffering, not the particular system or particular way in which resources are distributed. But you blame the victim for his or her suffering. I don't think that that's the only interpretation of karma. I argue against it. I think that karma basically offers us two important and relevant insights. One is that we should be very responsible in our choices, because choices are consequential. And secondly, choices, sometimes the effects of our actions take some time to manifest, but they do manifest. Like climate change, we are seeing, it's a slow process, but it is happening. So I think we need interpretations of karma that are not fatalistic and allow us to think more deeply about structural issues that are the causes of suffering. The fifth and last point I want to make, in this section of my lecture, is what I might describe as very personalized I might say even very spiritualized understanding of suffering, or dukkha. So dukkha may be construed, dukkha means suffering, may be construed and has been construed primarily as an inner condition of unhappiness or anxiety that results from ignorance or from avidya. So it's primarily construed as an inward condition and as an individualized condition as well. And I'm not saying that, that's not one way of thinking about it, but I think we can also expand this understanding. There are no good reasons in Advaita why we must ignore the suffering or dukkha of human beings when they lack opportunities to attain the necessities for dignified and decent living, or when suffering is inflicted through oppression and injustice based on gender, birth, hierarchical race construction. Because there is no glorification of involuntary suffering or involuntary poverty in the broad Hindu tradition. Artha, or economic well-being, is one of the 4 fundamental goals of Hindu life, as you may well know, along with karma, ethical conduct or dharma, and finally liberation. So working to overcome suffering means identifying, enlarging our understanding of dukkha or suffering, and identifying those political, social, economic structures that cause and perpetuate suffering. So my point in this section, in identifying these 5 areas of challenge, is to be realistic. Is also to be self-critical and to see where there are challenges in understanding the tradition. But I'm trying to show also, as I hope you see, that there are alternative ways in thinking about all of these issues that provide positive ethical and moral resources for Advaita being relevant to our thinking about the SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals. So let me now turn in the next part of my talk, the second and the final section, to connect. I've already done some of that, but to connect a little more closely, Advaita and sustainable goals. I do this under 6 headings because I think the sustainable development goals can be organized under these 6 headings. So this is one way of organizing the material in this vast text. The first is prosperity. And as I said already, it's very clear that Advaita as a Hindu tradition has never given its blessings to involuntary poverty. We have the poverty of the renunciant, but involuntary poverty is never commended or praised in this tradition. In fact, it recognizes poverty as a great cause of dukkha or suffering. So I already mentioned, that artha is one of life's 4 goals, and we should, certainly we should understand artha to include the basic necessities that every human being requires for dignified and decent living: food, healthcare, education, shelter, clothing, and so it's very important. If we attest to the fact that artha is a desirable goal for all human beings, as we do, and I have listed what we can bring under artha, then we can't stop there. We have then to inquire, take the next step. What are those structures? What is it that impedes human beings from attaining those basic life needs? What are the structures, social, political, economic, that deny persons the opportunities to attain life's necessities? These have to be identified as a next step. And then, of course, the measures, policy measures that are required to make these necessities accessible must be advanced. But of course, we don't, in the Advaita tradition, there's no time to, we don't, of course, say that wealth alone is necessary, is enough for a flourishing human life. We require much more. I think in this case also, there is an important resource that we can draw upon. And this is again, it's one of the life goals of the tradition, which is dharma. And I think we should think of dharma as paying special attention to the social reality that we can't be concerned only about our individual well-being. Dharma calls upon us to be concerned about, to work for the wider good. It offers ethics. It offers an ethics of human relationships that I think speak also to distribution of wealth and economic resources. And I would want to say that we have to extend thinking about dharma to not only to individuals but also to corporations. It's a point that I'll try to make a little bit later. So as far as prosperity is concerned, I think this is where I would want to make the connection between Advaita and Sustainable Development Goals, because several of these goals are concerned about lifting human beings from conditions of poverty. And I think Advaita would definitely say yes to this as a goal. Secondly, we have all of the goals and all of these are of course related, it's an interrelated document, but so much of the SDGs speak also to our concern about the planet, planetary well-being, environmental sustainability. And here I think, it's Advaita, again, broadly Hindu tradition, sees the world of nature as having intrinsic value that is derived from the important theology that the sacred divine, the infinite divine, exists equally and identically in everything. So development that is anthropocentric, that focuses only on the well-being of humans to the exclusion of all life, all other life forms, and the planet, is in fact antithetical to Advaita understanding. We don't have a right to dominate, possess, make all other living beings subservient to our needs and wants. So an Advaita view of sustainable development promotes the flourishing of all life. And again, go back to Loka Sangraha, which, as I mentioned, is very inclusive developmental vision. We can't extract ourselves, right? You can't extract ourselves from the world of nature. We are formed of the universe. We represent it in our bodies. We are organically connected. The earth is in everything solid in our bodies, water in all that is liquid, fire in the body's warmth and energy, air in the breath, and speech, a space in our speech and sound. It is so important voice to this cosmology in our thinking about development, because we have become strangers and we are alienated, from our planet. Failing to understand that, when we injure the planet, we fundamentally injure ourselves. So, from an Advaita perspective, our ecological crisis is also a crisis of self-understanding. It's a crisis of meaning. It is a spiritual crisis, and while it has to be addressed in different ways, it also has to be addressed from this spiritual place of meaning, which is to an invitation to treat the planet with respect, with reverence, as a wonderful outpouring of the infinite. You see this in so many beautiful verses in the Bhagavad Gita that invites us to see the infinite in the taste of water, in the brilliance of the moon and sun, in the fragrance of the earth, and so on. And then you have, one of my favorite texts from the Shvetashvetara Upanishad speaks of the divine presence in the dark blue bird, the green one with red eyes, the rain cloud, the seasons, the oceans. So I think, an ethic of environmental sustainability can also flow from this vision of sacredness, of reverence, that is so much embedded in Advaita and the broader Hindu tradition. Thirdly, people. So prosperity, planet, people. It's a people, I think Advaita, as far as sustainable development goals, is a people-centered, but not anthropocentric. Let me always clarify that, but certainly a a people-centered way of thinking about development that again has its source in the inherent dignity and equal worth of every human being. And that again comes from the vision of life's unity and the presence of the sacred divine identically in every sentient, let's say every sentient being. This is, for me, the antidote to any effort to deny personhood, to deny the value and dignity of any human being. We can't honor, we cannot, in Advaita, we cannot honor the sacred and dishonor or devalue human beings. It's so fundamentally contradictory. We cannot give our assent or support any social or cultural system that is founded on human inequality and indignity, to see women as inferior to men, to prefer the boy child over the girl child, to mistreat the elderly, to ascribe unequal worth and to demean persons on the basis of birth or gender, are fundamentally contradictory to the deepest vision of the Advaita tradition. Fourth, and I'll be very brief because for me it was so important in the Sustainable Development Goals that the goals also speak about the concern and well-being of children in our world. And that's a highly commendable aspiration. In the Advaita tradition, children have the same dignity and value as adults. We don't attribute dignity and value on the basis of age differentiation. It springs from the sacred that is present identically in the child and in the adult. So from an Advaita perspective, dignity is not dependent on biological age or emotional or intellectual maturity. It is intrinsic. Children are not valuable because they serve adult needs. They are valuable because of their intrinsic worth. So this intrinsic value of the child must find, expression in policies that allow for the flourishing of the child. And I see this implies for me that we have an obligation to ensure that we protect children from cultural practices, from beliefs, from economic conditions that don't allow them to flourish. We have an obligation to ensure they have opportunities for healthy life, for education, for leisure and for happiness. Forcing children into a life of arduous work is contrary to Advaita and to Hindu teachings for so many reasons. So the obligation to the child, brings together some of the central ethics of the Advaita tradition. And fifth, I think the fifth goal of the Sustainable Development Goals is peace. I think in Advaita we need to connect this goal of peace or shanti with ahimsa and with justice. I think the ethical value that most eloquently expresses the reverence for life that is at the heart of this tradition is non-injury or ahimsa, which is always regarded as the foremost or the cardinal ethical principle. So you may know that Mahatma Gandhi, in his exegesis of ahimsa, says that in its negative form it means abstention from harm or injury to sentient beings. But in its positive form, which he emphasized more, it is the practice of love and compassion for all. And for Gandhi, ahimsa, and he was very explicit about this, ahimsa means justice towards everyone and abstention from all forms of exploitation. In fact, in one very powerful moment, he said that you cannot claim to be a practitioner of non-violence if you are not committed also to social justice. So the inseparability of peace and justice, I think, is a very important connection that we need to make. And we need to move these values. So for example, ahimsa, we need to move these values from the sphere of personal relationships and into the social sphere. I think this is a fundamental contribution of Mahatma Gandhi to our thinking. And you know, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., the great civil rights leader here in the United States, whose legacy is so important to the United States, but also to the world, said something about Gandhi on this issue. And I'm going to quote this because it is so significant for me. He said, you know, Gandhi was probably the first person in history to lift the love ethic of Jesus above mere interaction between individuals to a powerful and effective social force on a large scale. Love for Gandhi was a potent instrument for social and collective transformation, end of quote. So I think, you know, that's an amazing tribute to Mahatma Gandhi coming from someone who regarded himself as his student. But the point here is that Gandhi helped us to see how personal virtues such as non-injury or love may become social virtues, and they may be used to effectively challenge and transform institutions and social structures. He brought non-injury or ahimsa out of the private sphere and into the public sphere. And I think this is what we need to do with the resources of Advaita in our thinking, to bring virtues that were privatized or belonged exclusively to the interpersonal sphere and ask about their application to the social sphere. This connection is necessary to make for a vigorous relationship between the Advaita tradition and the developmental goals. And we cannot do this, of course, without partnerships, which is another important dimension of the development goals. Advaita can't do it alone. The Hindu tradition can't do it alone. This is why, you know, interreligious collaboration becomes so vital, so necessary. Any religious tradition, Advaita or otherwise, which is concerned about the social order and its transformation, or about sustainable development goals, is challenged today to reach across borders, to find common ground and values with people of other religions or those without religious commitment, to confront and overcome the sources of human suffering. In other words, our hopes for just and peaceful communities, flourishing communities, will only be realized together, or we will not realize at all. And, you know, I think our global pandemic is a very good example of that. We can't protect ourselves unless we protect the entire planet. We can't protect ourselves unless we protect our world. Our commitment to overcoming of suffering requires not only interreligious partnerships, but the partnerships between religious traditions and every agency working for human development. Religion can be a very positive source of moral energy, a positive inspiration for human will in overcoming the fundamental sources of human suffering. So I thank you very much. You know, I've spoken long. Thank you for being patient listeners to me. I will stop here. And I hope this overview, which is what it is, of how we might, how the Advaita tradition might speak to the sustainable development goals, you know, has given you a lot to think about. And I am happy to receive any questions that you might have, or not only questions, but even for me to learn from your own thinking, some thoughts that you might have to share. So thank you. You can, I guess you can unmute yourself and
that was a really wonderful talk, Dr. Rambachan. It was perfect. Actually, we barely covered every single principle that you had mentioned about, and so I think it gave them a much deeper interpretation of the very topics, all the topics that you covered. So I will. So requesting the students, you can either do a hand raise or just jump in and ask your questions at this point of time. I think that was a very, very interesting talk. I hope you all took notes. So opening the floor for questions.
Dr. Bhavani, this is Debashish. Can I go ahead?
Please go ahead.
Yes.
Just introduce yourself
Sir, I have
one sentence, and just you can maybe talk about the topic also, so that sir has some reference.
Okay. Oh, wonderful. Sure. Sir, this is Debashish Brahma. I'm doing research on application of drones for disaster management. I'm under the E4 Life program. Yeah.
Okay.
My question, sir, is the world already has a treasure of Advaita. Not when I say Advaita, I don't only mean the heritage of spiritual knowledge that is part of the Bhagavad Gita, but like you said, the larger social dimension of inclusiveness, which sustainable development goals are also part of. A lot of that treasure is in the form of culture. By culture, I mean ancient stories or songs, festivals, and social systems like a family system, ancestry. Things like we do a Pitru Havan, for example, honoring our ancestors, and many other things, and faiths and belief systems of being married for 7 lives, for instance, a commitments which stretch beyond personal interests, and there are so many things which are a part of our culture and traditions, and I'm sure, and I've had the opportunity to also know that such is the case with other places like Africa and many other natives also. Now, how can we uplift those things to bring it up to the center stage of global policy, like we have, for example, poverty or malnutrition, or for example, infrastructure issues? These things tend to take center stage, but only solving this is not going to solve the larger problem. We have seen it with developed nations. There has to be a larger understanding of the Gandhian principles to build a rock bed, the bedrock of a stable society. Now, what can be done to link these things and bring them up to the center stage of global policymakers? Are there ways that is already being explored? I know a couple of things that even spiritual leaders in the world, like Amma, is doing tremendous work in those directions. Please do share with me any thoughts you have on that, or any very striking or very impactful measures that you think are going to be the future track for these things. Thank you, sir. Thank you very much for the talk and even for hearing my question.
Yes, no, Debashish, thank you so much for this important point that you are making. And I agree with all that you've said. I think that, you quite correctly mentioned that, certain values, certain central, certain core values, essential values are present, and they pervade, so much dimensions of culture, family life, and so on. And so I think you've also, identified the challenge there, which is, I briefly referenced it in my talk, which is to move these values, these resources from the sphere of interpersonal relationships into the social sphere. So when we look at, say, many of the important documents of our times, the UN Declaration of Human Rights, the Child Rights Document, and now we have the Sustainable Development Goals. So many, I would say all of these documents, the human rights, child rights, sustainable development goals, fundamentally reflect, and in the formulation of these documents, while we might not be aware of it, there was a lot of input from the world's religious traditions. But then the language of the documents, in order to be universally applicable, did not reference any particular religious teaching, tradition, or doctrine, but they are present in the fundamental values that undergird these documents or the Sustainable Development Goals. And that's why I reference, from a Hindu position, I reference that universally recited Hindu prayer, Sarve Bhavantu Sukhinaha, which or Loka Samasta Sukhino Bhavantu. So our challenge, Debashish, and I think you are pointing to that, is now, how do we, starting with those fundamental moral commitments and values, these are not meaningful unless we take that step now of saying, what are the policies that are necessary for making these a reality? We need to move from personal virtue to social policy. And one of the things that concern me in this movement is the role of corporations. Corporations have a very important role to play, because so much of the resources of our world are held by these corporations. And so if we are to achieve these social development goals, we need the commitment also of the gigantic corporations of our world. They must also be motivated by a deep moral concern for human well-being, and not simply profit making, because this has not been at the heart of the Advaita or the Hindu tradition. There is a deep critique of greed that we should not miss. And we need to think about greed and the overcoming of greed as social virtues. When policies, are narrowly identified with profit making, then there's a deep price that the common good pays for that. So I think it's a complex answer that you identify in a problem that requires a complex answer, but I think it comes down again to how do we inspire human beings in all spheres of life, the corporate, the state, and other enterprises, to ensure that policies that promote the human well-being and also planetary sustainability are implemented. The bridging of this divide between moral virtue and public policy.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. And in fact, it has opened up so many dimensions through you, because you're also one of the prominent global thinkers today. This is my wish and the idea that I pitch forward, that maybe in the future, Bhagavad Gita be considered a guiding principle of the SDGs. It's my wish, and it's a little personal, and we might need a little debate on this. But somehow I feel, on my personal experience, that are inherent in the Advaita should be considered officially more, recognized and officially part of the guiding principles of the SDGs. Thank you, sir. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. Appreciate it. Thank you for offering your thoughts and perspectives. Value these.
Hello, sir. Hi. This is Abhijit again. Hi.
Yes.
Sir, I have a very different question. Okay. So my question goes, is that how to make the Advaita knowledge non-didactic? The current scenario, if we see, people are becoming very closed. As in, that how can we separate this knowledge from religion? Because I think when we bring in religion, most of the people, they just go away from the entire concept and start looking at it in a very different way. So how can we make this more universal? I know it is universal, like in my head and in my mind, I know. But for people, when you bring out such concepts, it's sometimes, I don't know, it's just a polarized world. So I don't know if you could share your thoughts on this. I'll be super, super grateful. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. No, it's an excellent question, Abhijit. And I think that Advaita, as a tradition, I want to say, first of all, that it makes claims, it has a vision of the meaning of human existence that is universal. It doesn't speak, it speaks to the human being. It doesn't speak to the human being in any particular ethnic or cultural or national group. It speaks universally to the human person and to human predicaments, I would say. It speaks to human predicaments. But it is also true, and this is where I think your point is important. It is also true that, you know, almost every worldview has been embedded in particular cultural frameworks, particular cultural structures. And that's for historical reasons. So then, you know, they get so closely interlinked. But I think, you know, given our globalized world today, we have a special opportunity. And I think the opportunity, and which comes always, Abhijit, with a challenge, is how do we translate and how do we retrieve what is a fundamentally human teaching and a human vision and offer it to the human community. And that's, you know, where we have to challenge ourselves to do that. I think we have great teachers who have tried to do it and have done it, you know, with varying degrees of success. So Abhijit, if you think of Swami Vivekananda in 1893, it's, you know, who made this long journey from his homeland in India to come to the United States to speak for the first time about, and of course he was speaking about the Advaita tradition, but what he was doing is exactly what you were saying, you know, we have to continue doing. He sought to universalize the Advaita tradition, to draw on, to share with the world what he saw as its, you know, its deep gifts to human beings everywhere. And I think that that remains a task that must be ongoing and must be taken up. In other words, we don't have to, you know, to sever its special relationship with, you know, the home tradition and its connectedness with, in so many dimensions of Indian culture, but at the same time, it is not limited culturally. And I think both can be done beautifully, but the vision has to be a human vision on the well-being of humanity.
Thank you so much, sir. You answered it really well, and you're doing a great job at it as well. So thank you.
You're kind of, Vijay. Thank you.
May I ask a question?
Oh, please.
Okay, Dr. Rambachan, I'm Anushri. I'm a PhD fellow here at Amrita University from Belize. So it's nice to hear a Caribbean accent. I've been loving hearing your accent after being here in 5 years. I don't hear that. So yes. So but also living in India, surprisingly, where I thought my confidence in Advaita would grow, sometimes I think I question it along the lines of what you were saying, that perhaps it is something only for people who want to renounce the world and for people who want to live in the world and be a good person and be a spiritual person, but also enjoy life and not completely renounce everything. Then perhaps that's not the path for someone who wants to engage in life. So you were mentioning that that especially in the context of karma, and where I think about it a lot is in the context of sort of knowing yourself. Advaita says if you know your true self, then you don't suffer because you know it's not the soul that's suffering, it's the transient person, not the true self. But there is suffering, and you do suffer, and you do, things do happen in life that make life miserable. And you're allowed to feel that. I mean, you know that it's not the true you, that the soul doesn't experience suffering, but you're living in the world as a person also, in addition to the soul. So I thought I wanted to ask if you had any light on that to share with us.
Yes. Anushree, thank you so much for that, that very thoughtful question. And it is, I mean, you've identified a constellation of questions there about Advaita that of deep concern, and to me, personally also like you, but also as a, as an interpreter and as a teacher of the tradition. I think this question alone is worthy of a long and sustained answer, because at heart, there's so many components to what you've asked. One is, does Advaita really provide resources for flourishing life in this world, for those who are not renunciants? And that's why I started my talk by saying, that the primary interpreters of the tradition have been renunciants. They have read the text through the lens of renunciation, and so they have, focused on the resources of the text that, in their view, speak only to the life of the renunciant. But when I look at the text now, I'm not a renunciant. I am a father, I am a husband, I am a teacher. I recently have had twin granddaughters. So I have many roles. I live my life. I live my life, as immersed. And I'm an activist also. I work in organizations that are concerned with justice and social justice. And in all of these roles, personal, family, community, activist, teacher roles, I look to the Advaita tradition for my fundamental inspiration, for my fundamental guidance. But it is an Advaita tradition that I have also to interpret in new ways, in more bring a creativity to understanding the tradition. Because as you said, so poignantly about suffering, I have found, and I admit this, that this tendency to dismiss suffering, I think that's wrong. By appealing to the truth of a self does not suffer, but it doesn't answer, the questions of people who are immersed in suffering. And so I think that we should not, from an Advaita point of view, and I don't think the tradition necessarily has to be thought of in this way, is a tradition that we should not interpret it in ways, Anushree, that trivialize suffering. But take suffering very, very important. Certainly, I think it gives us resources for dealing with suffering, but we should not negate the fact of suffering or minimize it in every way as human beings. And I think, I hold that question. I just give a brief answer, but it's a question that deserves a much more thorough answer. And thank you for that.
Thank you, sir. It's good to know that you also share this concern. It's very relieving to know that a scholar like yourself is also bothered by this question. Thank you very much.
Absolutely.
I think Sailsha had her hand up to ask a question.
Oh, good evening. My name is Sailsha. I'm doing work in education with autism and also computing with young people. I'm a teacher at the moment, and I suppose I'm living in the UK, so feel very much part of the Western world and the responsibility that not just organizations, but the Western world has for the responsibility of where the planet is today. And I suppose my thoughts are maybe in some countries for the Sustainable Development Goals, it's about humans being at the center. But actually, I wonder if in a way, and this might be influenced by my Western upbringing, but that we need to take ourselves out of being at the center of everything and find our place back in the whole universe and the whole planet, and our rightful place. Because I think where I'm coming from, where a lot of the people that I know, it's like the humans feel entitled to things. You know, there was a lot of spiritual ideas about this abundance, you know, that's everywhere if you tap into it. But actually, we should, to me, it feels wrong. And the idea of ahimsa and non-violence is more about not doing harm, not just to other people, but in all our actions. And it's almost, I mean, some spiritual teachers will say it's almost impossible to live true ahimsa because everything that we do has some impact, you know, even just walking on a blade of grass. I know it sounds very extremist, but there's a lot of truth in it as well. So just this idea that we should be caretakers rather than the center, the hero of our story, if you know what I mean. So yeah, it's just this emphasis moving from people-centered to maybe finding our proper place in the universe. I don't know what your thoughts are on this, sir.
Thank you very much, Sel. I agree with you. I agree with you fully. And so I started off by speaking about a vision of Loka Sangraha, which is a flourishing of all, not only, it's not an anthropocentric vision, but I agree that, you know, because right now, you know, there's a lot of concern and discussion about ecological sustainability coming about from climate change and all of that. And, you know, still reflected in so many ways in this discussion is a anthropomorphic sentence, because, okay, now let's save the planet, because if we don't save the planet, you know, we will not be saved, you know, so we have to save ourselves. So it's still it's putting self at the center of it. And that's why I want to emphasize, I mentioned briefly, I mean, all of your questions today are very, I'm not being questions, and each one we could spend, you know, one class period just trying to discuss it. So I think that the Advaita that calls forth reverence for all life. And I include that the world of, you know, of water, else. And therefore, if we fully understand and internalize that vision of reverence for life, you know, it is an antidote to instrumentalizing, which I think is what your point, instrumentalizing everything for human needs, prioritizing human needs in a way that makes the well-being of every other sentient being subservient to our own needs. And I think we have to contest that, so I appreciate that point very much. We have to return to a vision of the intrinsic value and not the instrumental value of our planet for human needs. And that's a challenge, you know. Our religious traditions have to challenge themselves on this issue, and to retrieve the resources that promote this intrinsic respect and reverence for our planet, to go beyond instrumentalizing everything for our own needs. Thank you. I will, we could go on. Regretfully, you know, I have another class coming up, Professor J, Bhavani Ji, and I must take your leave. But it was really very beautiful. I mean it from my heart, and I mean it sincerely also, that we could, I wish, you know, each question deserves much more thorough discussion. You have very, very brilliant students. You've taught them well, and I can see that in their questions.
They're very, very precocious, and they're wonderful students. It's not because of anything that I have taught them. They have all these ideas from even before. But your talk basically excited those very things, and I'm sure that a lot of them have other questions, and we will continue the discussion. And I think
I'm very happy, Professor, to come back again. Let me put it in that way, to continue. I'm very happy.
Yes, and
let's plan.
And you would offer us frameworks to think about the 6 points, just intrinsic and instrumental value. There's just so much that they can actually build into what they're doing. Along with their developmental work that they can do, they can also add these lenses to that work. And I think that that's a part of the challenge even for this course, is to find out those elements that they want to bring into their PhD work. So again, I just want to tell you that one more little bit of information that before we wrap up. Dr. Rambachan has been invited regularly to the Vatican to talk about his the philosophy, the wisdom, and the application of Advaita and these principles to sustainable development goals. And he's therefore a very regular speaker at the Vatican. So it is his, again, I think this is a part of the Pope's vision on Laudato Si that he put out, on which talks about sustainable development. And Professor Rambachan is a key contributor to that as well, to that dialogue as well. And so, yes, so we hope to follow you and your work. Thank you so much for taking time and sharing your wisdom with us.
Yes, thank you so much, sir.
Thank you. Goodbye, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
On your videos.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Good to see you all now.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you.
Stay well. Stay well and stay safe. Bye.
Bye. Thank you, guys. I hope you enjoyed the talk.
It was a wonderful talk.
This is very nice, huh?
Yeah, it was very wonderful.
This is a very popular background nowadays.
Love it.
No, everybody in UCSD wants the background now. Whenever I go into the meeting. And I'm like, that is our Chhattisgarh village in India.
All right. So anybody who has other additional questions can post it on the group. And I'm sure that some of the students who are very well informed about these topics can help answer your questions. But he had given very, very, very interesting points that you may want to consider while designing your interventions. It's just a way of looking at things: prosperity, planet, people, even that becomes a framework to look at things. All right, I hope you enjoyed it. I did.
Okay.
Good night.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Bye, Action.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.